October 25th, 1944. 6:48 in the morning. Philippine Sea, off Samar Island. Ensign William C. Brooks, 22 years old, from Kansas City, stood watch on the bridge of escort carrier USS Fanshawe Bay when he saw something that made no sense. Through the morning haze on the northwestern horizon, he could make out shapes that didn't belong. Large shapes, moving fast, closing distance. He grabbed his binoculars and focused on the silhouettes. What he saw made his blood freeze. Pagoda masts, the distinctive towering superstructures of Japanese battleships. Multiple vessels, heavy cruisers flanking them, light cruisers, destroyers, an entire fleet bearing down on its position at high speed. Brooks shouted for the officer of the deck. Lieutenant Roberts ran to the bridge wing, took one look through his own binoculars, and immediately hit the general quarters alarm. The sound echoed across Fanshawe Bay and across the 5 other escort carriers of Taffy 3. The call sign for Escort Carrier Task Unit April 3rd, 77. What Ensign Brooks had spotted was a Japanese center force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. For battleships, including Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. The most powerful surface action group, the Imperial Japanese Navy, had committed to battle in over 2 years. And standing between this armada and the virtually defenseless American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf were 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts of Taffy 3. Small ships, slow ships, ships never designed for surface combat against capital vessels. The escort carriers could make maybe 18 knots maximum. They carried aircraft designed for anti-submarine patrol and ground support, not fleet engagement. Their defensive armament consisted of a single 5-inch gun on the stern. They had no armor worth mentioning. A single shell from a battleship's main guns would go through an escort carrier like tissue paper. The 3 destroyers, USS Johnston, USS Hull, USS Heermann, displaced 2,300 tons each. They carried 5 5-inch guns and 10 torpedo tubes. They could make 35 knots at flank speed. Against destroyers or light cruisers, they were formidable. Against battleships and heavy cruisers, they were hopelessly outmatched. The 4 destroyer escorts, USS Samuel B. Roberts, USS Dennis, USS John C. Butler, USS Raymond, were even smaller. 1,400 tons, 2 5-inch guns, 3 torpedo tubes, maximum speed 34 knots. They were designed to hunt submarines, not fight surface actions against capital ships. Yamato alone displaced 72,000 tons fully loaded. Her 9 18-inch guns could fire shells weighing 3,200 pounds to ranges exceeding 40,000 yards. Each of her shells weighed more than an entire destroyer escort. A single salvo from Yamato could obliterate any ship in Taffy 3. Admiral Clifton Sprague, 53 years old, from Dorchester, Massachusetts, commanded Taffy 3 from his flagship Fanshawe Bay. When the report came in of Japanese battleships closing from the northwest, Sprague faced a tactical situation with no good options. He could run south toward Leyte Gulf, but the escort carriers were too slow. Japanese battleships would overtake them within 2 hours. Running would mean destruction of his entire task unit, plus exposing invasion transports and support vessels in Leyte Gulf to Japanese guns. He could scatter his ships, hoping some might escape, while Japanese forces pursued others. But scattering would sacrifice any chance of coordinated defense and would abandon the jeep carriers to individual destruction. Or he could fight, order his destroyers and destroyer escorts to attack the Japanese force in hopes of disrupting their formation, buying time for carriers to launch aircraft and escape, accepting that the small ships charging into battle against overwhelming odds would likely be destroyed. Sprague ordered his escorts to make smoke and prepare for torpedo attack. Then he turned to the task unit's air operations frequency and ordered every available aircraft launched immediately. Every fighter, every torpedo bomber, every dive bomber, armed or unarmed, combat ready or not, everything that could fly. And aboard the destroyer USS Johnston, Commander Ernest E. Evans, 46 years old, from Pawnee, Oklahoma, didn't wait for specific orders to attack. He had already made his decision. Ernest Edwin Evans was born August 13, 1898, in Pawnee, Oklahoma. His father was part Cherokee, his mother white. Growing up in Oklahoma during the early 20th century as a mixed-race child meant Evans understood from early age what it meant to fight against expectations, against assumptions about what people like him could achieve. He attended Pawnee High School, excelling in academics and athletics. When World War I began, Evans was too young to enlist. By the time he reached eligible age, The war had ended, but the experience had given him direction. He wanted military service. He wanted command. In 1926, Evans received an appointment to the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis. He was one of very few Native Americans to attend the academy in that era. He graduated in 1931, ranked in the middle of his class academically, but noted for leadership ability and determination. Evans's early naval career followed typical peacetime progression: junior officer assignments on various vessels, steady advancement through the ranks. By 1941, he had achieved the rank of lieutenant commander and had commanded 2 destroyers on temporary assignment. When war came in December 1941, Evans was serving as executive officer aboard destroyer USS Alden. He spent 1942 and early 1943 in the Pacific, participating in various operations around New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. His performance reports consistently noted aggressive leadership style and willingness to take tactical risks. In February 1943, Evans received orders that would define the rest of his life. He was promoted to full commander and given command of a new Fletcher-Class destroyer under construction at Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding Corporation. The vessel will be designated DD-557. USS Johnston. Evans traveled to Seattle to oversee the final construction phases and to begin assembling his crew. Johnston was laid down March 3, 1942, launched March 25, 1943, and commissioned October 27, 1943. Evans took command on commissioning day. During the commissioning ceremony, Evans addressed his assembled crew. What he said that day will become legendary among those who served under him and among naval historians studying the Pacific War. This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way. Anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now. Nobody got off. Evans continued, "The Johnston will be my fighting ship. I intend to go into harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to follow me had better get off right now. I cannot guarantee your survival, but I can guarantee we will fight with everything we have." The speech reflected Evans's command philosophy completely. Aggressive action, direct engagement, no hesitation when combat presented itself. These principles would guide every tactical decision he made over the next year. Johnston departed Seattle in December 1943 for shakedown cruise and initial combat deployment. Evans drove his crew hard during training, conducting endless gunnery drills, damage control exercises, torpedo attack simulations. He wanted Johnston ready for combat at the highest possible level of proficiency. The ship deployed to the Pacific in early 1944, initially assigned to screen duty for carrier task forces. Evans demonstrated his aggressive tendencies immediately. When Japanese aircraft attacked a task force during operations near the Marshall Islands, Evans maneuvered Johnston between the attacking aircraft and the carriers, bringing all anti-aircraft weapons to bear. Johnston shot down 3 aircraft during the engagement and damaged 2 others. Evans received commendation for his actions. Throughout 1944, Johnston participated in operations across the Central Pacific. The Marianas Invasion in June, the liberation of Guam in July, screening duties for carrier strikes against Palau and the Philippines. Each operation gave Evans more experience, more confidence in his ship and crew, more conviction that aggressive action produced better results than defensive caution. By October 1944, Johnston had earned reputation as a particularly aggressive destroyer whose captain would engage any target without hesitation. Other destroyer skippers knew Evans would attack regardless of odds. His crew had absolute confidence in his tactical judgment, even when his decisions seemed reckless to outside observers. When Johnston received assignment to escort Carrier Task Unit April 3, 77, Taffy 3, for the Leyte Gulf operation, Evans viewed it as routine screening duty. Escort carriers operated far from front lines, launching aircraft against ground targets and conducting anti-submarine patrols. The assignment seemed unlikely to produce major surface action. That assessment would prove catastrophically wrong. USS Johnston was a Fletcher-Class destroyer, one of 175 vessels of that class built during World War II. The Fletcher-Class represented the U.S. Navy's standard destroyer design, balancing firepower, speed, range, and seaworthiness in a hull that could be mass-produced. Johnston measured 376 feet 6 inches in length, with a beam of 39 feet 7 inches. Her draft was 17 feet 9 inches fully loaded. Standard displacement was 2,300 tons. Full load displacement reached approximately 3,100 tons with fuel, ammunition, stores, and crew aboard. Power came from 4 Babcock and Wilcox boilers generating steam for 2 General Electric geared turbines producing 60,000 shaft horsepower. This power plant could drive Johnston to speeds exceeding 35 knots, roughly 40 miles per hour. Maximum range at economical cruising speed reached approximately 5,000 nautical miles. The main battery consisted of 5 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns in single mounts. 3 mounts forward, 2 aft. These guns could engage surface targets out to approximately 18,000 yards or anti-aircraft targets to 37,000 feet altitude. Rate of fire reached 15 to 20 rounds per minute per gun when crews were well-trained. Anti-aircraft armament included 10 40mm Bofors guns in twin mounts and 7 20mm Oerlikon cannons in single mounts. The 40mm weapons were effective against aircraft to about 5,000 yards. The 20mm guns provided last-ditch defense against close-range aerial attacks. The torpedo battery consisted of 2 quintuple-tube mounts amidships for a total of 10 21-inch torpedoes. The Mark 15 torpedo, carried by Fletcher-Class destroyers, had a range of approximately 6,000 yards at 45 knot speed, or 15,000 yards at 27 knots. The warhead contained approximately 800 pounds of Torpex explosive. Johnston's crew numbered approximately 327 officers and enlisted men at full complement. This included command staff, gunnery crews, engineering personnel, damage control teams, communication specialists, radar operators, and support personnel. The ship carried SG surface search radar that could detect large vessels out to approximately 20 miles in good conditions. SK air search radar could detect aircraft formations at ranges exceeding 100 miles. Fire control radar assisted the main battery in engaging targets beyond visual range. By October 1944, Johnston had been in continuous combat operations for nearly 10 months. The crew had gelled into a highly efficient team. Gun crews could maintain sustained fire rates that exceeded peacetime standards. Engineering personnel could coax maximum performance from machinery. Damage control teams had trained to handle any emergency. Commander Evans had molded Johnston into exactly what he promised during the commissioning ceremony, a fighting ship ready to go into harm's way. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, which would become the largest naval battle in history, began as Japan's desperate attempt to disrupt the American invasion of the Philippine Islands. General Douglas MacArthur's return to the Philippines began October 20th, 1944, when American forces landed on Leyte Island in the central Philippines. The landings were supported by massive American naval forces, including fast carrier task forces, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and hundreds of support vessels. The Japanese High Command recognized that loss of the Philippines would sever Japan's connection to resource-rich Southeast Asia. Without access to oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, Japan's war economy would collapse. The Philippines had to be held regardless of cost. Japanese planners developed Operation Sho-Go 1. Victory Operation 1. The plan called for coordinated attacks by multiple Japanese naval forces to destroy the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. If successful, the operation would devastate American naval power in the Pacific and potentially delay further American advances by months or even years. The plan was complex, requiring precise coordination between forces operating hundreds of miles apart. The Southern Force under Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura would approach Leyte Gulf from the south through Strait. The Center Force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would transit the sea beyond sea, pass through San Bernardino Strait, then sweep down Samar's eastern coast to attack the invasion fleet from the north. The Northern Force under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would approach from the northeast, using Japan's remaining carriers as bait to draw the American fast carrier task forces away from Leyte Gulf. The plan depended on American commanders taking the bait. If Admiral William Halsey commanding 3rd Fleet pursued Ozawa's carriers northward, San Bernardino Strait would be undefended. Kurita's center force could then approach Leyte Gulf unopposed except for the light escort forces protecting the invasion fleet directly. October 23rd through 24 saw multiple engagements as American forces attempted to stop the Japanese advance. American submarines sank 2 heavy cruisers from Kurita's center force in the Palawan Passage. American carrier aircraft attacked center force in the sea beyond sea, sinking super battleship Musashi. The Southern Force was annihilated by American battleships and cruisers in Surigao Strait during a night action. Most critically, Halsey took the bait. When his reconnaissance aircraft reported Ozawa's carrier force approaching from the north, Halsey ordered 3rd Fleet's powerful Task Force 38, 6 fleet carriers, 5 light carriers, 6 fast battleships, 8 cruisers, and over 40 destroyers to pursue and destroy the Japanese carriers. He left San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. Kurita's center force having survived the air attacks in Sea Beyond Sea, transited San Bernardino Strait during the night of October 24th to 25th. By dawn on October 25th, Kurita's 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers were steaming south along Samar's eastern coast, heading directly toward the American escort carrier groups that were providing air support for the Leyte invasion. 3 escort carrier task units operated off Samar that morning. Taffy 1 to the south, Taffy 2 in the center, Taffy 3 to the north, directly in Kurita's path. Admiral Thomas Sprague, commanding Taffy 1, had no heavy warships under his command. Admiral Felix Stump, commanding Taffy 2, had no heavy warships. Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, had 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. When Kurita's lookout spotted the American escort carriers at approximately 0645, they initially thought they found Halsey's fleet carriers. By the time Japanese officers realized these were escort carriers, not fleet carriers, Kurita had already ordered his forces to attack at maximum speed. The most powerful Japanese surface force committed to battle in over 2 years was bearing down on 6 escort carriers and 7 small warships that had no chance of surviving conventional engagement. Commander Evans received Admiral Sprague's order to make smoke and prepare for torpedo attack at approximately 0655. Johnston was on the northern edge of Taffy 3's formation, between the escort carriers and the approaching Japanese force. Evans didn't wait for further orders. He immediately ordered flank speed and turned Johnston directly toward the Japanese fleet. His executive officer, Lieutenant Robert Hagen, looked at him in disbelief. The attack order had been prepared for torpedo attack, not to attack immediately, and certainly not to attack alone without coordinating with the other destroyers. Evans's response was characteristically direct. "We're going in. Right now. Flank speed. All guns prepare to engage." Johnston surged forward at 35 knots, her engine straining to produce maximum power. Behind her, a dense white cloud of chemical smoke began pouring from smoke generators mounted on her stern. The smoke would provide cover for the escort carriers, concealing them from Japanese optical rangefinders. At 0700, Johnston opened fire with her forward 5-inch guns at maximum range, approximately 18,000 yards, just over 10 miles. The initial salvos fell short, but Evans's gunnery officer, Lieutenant Ed DeGardy, quickly adjusted. By the 4th salvo, Johnston's shells were landing among the Japanese formation. The Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano, leading the cruiser column, became Johnston's primary target. Kumano displaced 15,000 tons and mounted 10 8-inch guns. She could destroy Johnston with a single well-placed salvo. But Johnston had surprise, speed, and aggression on her side. Johnston's 5-inch guns fired as fast as the crews could load them, approximately 15 rounds per minute per gun, 75 rounds per minute total from all 5 guns. The shells, each weighing 55 pounds, began striking Kumano's superstructure. The explosions damaged Kumano's fire control systems and started fires on her bridge. Japanese lookouts aboard Yamato spotted Johnston charging toward the formation. The battleship's massive 18-inch guns trained toward the American destroyer. Each of Yamato's 9 main battery guns could fire shells weighing 3,200 pounds to ranges exceeding 40,000 yards. A single hit would obliterate Johnston. Yamato fired. The massive shells created enormous water spouts as they fell around Johnston, short, over, wide. The salvos were falling close enough that spray from the shell impacts cascaded over Johnston's bridge. But in the chaos of battle with multiple targets and rapidly changing ranges, Yamato's gunners couldn't achieve the precision needed to hit a destroyer-sized target maneuvering at high speed. Evans continued closing range. At approximately 7,000 yards, less than 4 miles, Johnston reached effective torpedo range. Evans ordered both quintuple torpedo mounts to fire. All 10 torpedoes launched in rapid sequence, their tracks racing to the water toward the Japanese cruiser column at 45 knots. The torpedoes reached their targets approximately 90 seconds after launch. Multiple explosions erupted along Kumano's hull. The heavy cruiser slewed to port, her bow blown completely off by torpedo hits. She began taking water forward, losing speed, falling out of formation. Kumano would survive the battle but would spend the rest of the war under repair, effectively eliminated as a combat unit. Johnston had accomplished what seemed impossible. A single destroyer had disabled a heavy cruiser 20 times her tonnage through aggressive point-blank attack. But the cost of that success was about to come due. Having fired all her torpedoes, Johnston turned hard to port to retreat under cover of her own smoke. But the maneuver brought her broadside to the Japanese battleship line. Yamato, Nagato, and Kongo all had Johnston in their sights. The battleships fired in sequence. Massive shells began falling around Johnston in dense salvos. Evans ordered hard rudder and speed changes, attempting to throw off the Japanese gunnery solutions. For several minutes, Johnston's luck held. The battleship shells fell close, terrifyingly close, but scored no direct hits. Then at 0718, Johnston's luck ran out. A salvo from either Yamato or Congo. Survivors would never know which battleship scored the hits. Struck Johnston amidships. 3 14-inch or 18-inch shells hit Johnston in rapid succession. The first shell struck just below the bridge, penetrating Johnston's hull and exploding inside the forward engine room. The explosion killed everyone in the compartment instantly, approximately 20 men. Steam lines ruptured. Electrical systems failed. The forward engine room became a sealed tomb of twisted metal and scalding steam. The second shell struck Johnston's aft gun director, the position from which Lieutenant DeGardy controlled the aft 5-inch guns. The explosion killed DeGardy and everyone in the director station. The aft guns lost fire control and had to switch to local manual control. The third shell struck Johnston's stern near the aft engine room. This shell penetrated but failed to explode. A dud. But even without exploding, the shell's kinetic energy tore a massive hole in Johnston's hull. Seawater began flooding into the aft engine spaces. Johnston lost 50% of her engine power instantly. Her speed dropped from 35 knots to 17 knots. She lost steering control temporarily as hydraulic systems failed. Communications between bridge and engine rooms were severed. Half her fire control systems were destroyed. Commander Evans had been standing on the bridge wing when the shells hit. The concussion from the explosions threw him against the bulkhead. He suffered severe injuries. 2 fingers on his left hand were blown off, lacerations across his face and torso, probable internal injuries from the impact. Blood covered his uniform. But Evans remained conscious and in command. He staggered back to his feet, assessed the damage reports coming in from throughout the ship, and began issuing orders for damage control and emergency repairs. Johnston's situation was desperate. She had lost half her power plant. Her fire control systems were seriously damaged. She had casualties throughout the ship, and she was still under fire from multiple Japanese battleships and cruisers, anyone which could sink her with a single salvo. Most commanders would have retreated under smoke, attempted to disengage, worked to save their ship. Evans did the opposite. He ordered Johnston back toward the Japanese formation. His reasoning was brutally simple. Johnston was already heavily damaged. Retreat wouldn't save her. The Japanese ships were faster and could pursue until they finished her off. But by continuing to engage, by continuing to draw Japanese fire, Johnston could pull Japanese attention away from the escort carriers. Every minute Japanese battleship spent shooting at Johnston was another minute the carriers had to escape. Evans ordered his remaining operational guns to continue firing at any Japanese vessel in range. Johnston's 3 forward 5-inch guns and 1 aft gun that had regained local control continued engaging targets. The volume of fire had decreased dramatically, but Johnston kept shooting. Johnston was not alone in her desperate charge. The other 2 destroyers of Taffy 3 screen, USS Hull and USS Herman, received Admiral Sprague's order to execute torpedo attack and began their own runs toward the Japanese formation. USS Hull under Commander Leon Kentberger attacked from a different angle than Johnston, targeting the battleship Congo. Hull closed within 9,000 yards before launching her torpedoes, then turned to retreat under smoke. But like Johnston, Hull came under concentrated fire from multiple Japanese warships. Hull was hit repeatedly by shells from battleships and cruisers. The destroyer's bridge was destroyed. Her engine rooms were flooded. Her main battery was knocked out, but Hull remained afloat and continued fighting with whatever weapons remained operational. USS Herman under Commander Amos Hathaway made a solo torpedo run against a heavy cruiser Higuro, forcing the Japanese cruiser to turn away to avoid torpedoes. Herman then positioned herself between the Japanese battleships and the escort carriers, laying smoke and firing her 5-inch guns at ranges where she couldn't possibly survive if the Japanese concentrated fire on her. But the most remarkable attack came from the destroyer Escorts, ships even smaller and more lightly armed than the destroyers. USS Samuel B. Roberts, a 1,400-ton destroyer escort with only 2 5-inch guns and 3 torpedoes, charged into battle against Japanese heavy cruisers. Commander Robert Copeland ordered his ship to engage at point-blank range. Samuel B. Roberts closed within 4,000 yards of the heavy cruiser Cherokee and opened fire with both 5-inch guns. For over an hour, Samuel B. Roberts' duel with Cherokee and other Japanese cruisers at ranges where destroyer Escort had no business surviving. Her 5-inch guns fired over 600 rounds, more ammunition than the ship was designed to carry. When the ready ammunition was exhausted, crew members formed human chains passing shells up from the magazines. Samuel B. Roberts scored multiple hits on Cherokee, starting fires and damaging the cruiser's superstructure. But the destroyer Escort was taking hits as well. Japanese 8-inch shells punched through her thin hull, exploding inside her machinery spaces and magazine areas. At approximately 0851, a Japanese shell struck Samuel B. Roberts' aft magazine. The resulting explosion broke the ship's back. Samuel B. Roberts rolled over and sank stern first, taking 90 men down with her, including Commander Copeland, who went down with the ship. The destroyer Escorts Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond also engaged despite their light armament, laying smoke, making faint torpedo runs, and firing their 5-inch guns at ranges where they could barely reach the Japanese ships. Before we continue with how Johnston fought for another 90 minutes despite catastrophic damage, why Commander Evans refused to abandon ship even when ordered to do so, and how these 7 small warships saved the American invasion fleet through sheer determination. If you're fascinated by these stories of impossible courage against overwhelming odds, of commanders who chose to fight rather than retreat, of small ships facing giants and refusing to back down, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We publish deeply researched military history documentaries every week that bring you the untold stories of men and women who changed history through courage that went beyond any reasonable expectation. These are the stories that deserve to be remembered, the actions that define what it means to serve with honor. Now back to 0830 on October 25th, 1944, and the destroyer that refused to die. By 0830, Johnston had been fighting continuously for nearly 90 minutes. The ship was a floating wreck. Casualties exceeded 100 men killed or seriously wounded. Half the engineering plant was destroyed. Most fire control systems were offline, but Johnston continued engaging any Japanese vessel that came within range. Evans, still conscious despite his injuries and loss of blood, maintained command from the bridge. His executive officer Hagen had taken over much of the tactical direction, but Evans made all major decisions, which targets to engage, when to maneuver, how to employ Johnston's dwindling capabilities. The situation for Taffy 3 remained desperate, but was improving slightly. The escort carriers had managed to maintain enough distance from the Japanese battleships that the 18-inch guns couldn't achieve decisive hits. Aircraft from all 3 Taffy groups were attacking the Japanese formation continuously, scoring hits and forcing the Japanese ships to maneuver defensively. Most importantly, the aggressive attacks by Johnston, Hull, Heermann, and the destroyer escorts had thrown the Japanese formation into chaos. Kurita's ships were scattered across 20 miles of ocean, each captain maneuvering independently to avoid torpedoes and engage targets. The coordinated attack Kurita had planned had degenerated into confused melee. At approximately 0845, Johnston came under attack from a new threat: Japanese destroyers that had worked around the American formation's flank. The destroyer Yahagi closed within 7,000 yards and opened fire with her 6 5-inch guns. Johnston returned fire with her remaining operational guns. The exchange at close range lasted approximately 15 minutes. Johnston scored multiple hits on Yahagi, starting fires and damaging the Japanese destroyer's forward guns. But Johnston was also hit repeatedly. Another gun mount was knocked out. More casualties. More flooding. At 0900, a heavy cruiser, possibly Tone or Chikuma, achieved accurate fire on Johnston from approximately 10,000 yards. The cruiser's 8-inch guns fired repeated salvos. Johnston was hit multiple times in rapid succession. One shell struck Johnston's remaining engine room. The explosion ruptured steam lines and destroyed the main reduction gear. Johnston lost all power. Her speed dropped to 0. She went dead in the water, unable to maneuver, unable to generate power for pumps or fire control. Without power, Johnston could not aim her guns effectively or pump out flooding. The ship began listing to port as water accumulated in flooded compartments. Evans knew Johnston was finished as a fighting unit. At approximately 0910, Evans gave the order to abandon ship. Crew members who could reach the deck began going over the side. Many were wounded. Life rafts and flotation nets were deployed. Men who couldn't swim grabbed anything that would float. But Evans himself refused to leave the bridge. When Lieutenant Hagen urged him to abandon ship while there was still time, Evans refused. "I'm staying with my ship," he said. His injuries were severe. He had lost significant blood. He could barely stand. But he would not leave Johnston's bridge. At 0945, approximately 3 hours after the battle began, USS Johnston rolled onto her port side and sank bow first into the Philippine Sea. She went down in approximately 3,000 feet of water, about 50 miles east of Samar Island. Of Johnston's crew of 327 officers and enlisted men, 141 were killed in action or died of wounds. 186 survived, rescued over the following 2 days by American destroyers and destroyer escorts that returned to search the battle area. Commander Ernest E. Evans was not among the survivors. The last men to leave Johnston's bridge reported seeing Evans still standing at his station as the ship went under. His body was never recovered. Several survivors reported seeing a Japanese destroyer captain salute Johnston as she sank, a mark of respect for a courageous enemy. Whether this actually occurred or became a apocryphal story cannot be confirmed, but it reflected the respect Johnston had earned through her actions. USS Hull sank at approximately 0855, 45 minutes before Johnston. Of Hull's crew of 330, only 86 survived. Commander Kentberger went down with his ship. USS Samuel B. Roberts sank at approximately 0905. Of her crew of 224, 120 survived. Commander Copeland was not among them. The escort carrier survived. All 6, Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinan Bay, Kitcon Bay, and Gambier Bay, were damaged. Gambier Bay sank after being hit repeatedly by Japanese cruiser fire, but the other 5 escaped. At approximately 0920, Vice Admiral Kurita made a decision that remains controversial among naval historians. Despite having the American escort carriers within range, despite having achieved tactical surprise, Kurita ordered his forces to break off the attack and retire northward toward San Bernardino Strait. His reasoning reflected the confusion that the American destroyers' attacks had created. Kurita believed he was engaging fleet carriers, not escort carriers. He thought American battleships were approaching from the south. This was false, but radio intercepts had misled him. He believed he had sunk multiple carriers. In fact, only Gambier Bay had been sunk. His ships were scattered across miles of ocean, low on ammunition, under constant air attack. Kurita decided withdrawal was prudent rather than continuing the attack. That decision saved the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. If Kurita had pressed his attack, his battleships and cruisers would have reached the virtually defenseless transports and support vessels in Leyte Gulf. The resulting destruction would have been catastrophic. The battle off Samar ended at approximately 0930, with Japanese forces withdrawing northward. Taffy 3 had survived despite facing odds that no reasonable tactical analysis suggested they could overcome. Taffy 3's losses in the battle off Samar: USS Johnston sunk, 141 killed. USS Hull sunk, 253 killed. USS Samuel B. Roberts sunk, 90 killed. USS Gambier Bay sunk, 147 killed. Total, for ships sunk, 631 men killed. Japanese center force losses: Heavy cruiser Chokai sunk by air attack. Heavy cruiser Chikuma sunk by air attack. Heavy cruiser Suzuya sunk by air attack. Heavy cruiser Kumano crippled, later sunk by submarine. Several other vessels damaged. Approximately 1,000 casualties total. More important than ships sunk was the operational outcome. Kurita's center force failed to reach Leyte Gulf. The American invasion fleet was never engaged. The landings at Leyte continued without major naval interference. Japan's last major naval offensive in the Pacific had been turned back. The battle off Samar demonstrated principles that would influence naval warfare thinking for decades afterward. Aggressive action by smaller vessels could disrupt and defeat larger forces if executed with sufficient determination. Psychological factors, surprise, confusion, fear of torpedo attack, could overwhelm material superiority. Commanders willing to sacrifice their ships could achieve strategic results far beyond their unit's theoretical capabilities. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's decision to withdraw at the moment of victory remains one of the most debated tactical decisions of World War II. Naval historians have argued for decades about whether Kurita made the right choice or throw away Japan's last chance for meaningful naval victory. The arguments for Kurita's withdrawal focus on the tactical situation as he understood it. His ships were scattered across 20 miles of ocean, making coordinated action impossible. He was under constant air attack from Taffy 3's aircraft and from land-based aircraft from Leyte. His ammunition stocks were depleted after hours of combat. His reconnaissance had been poor throughout the operation, leaving him uncertain about American force dispositions. Most critically, Kurita believed he was engaging fleet carriers, not escort carriers. The aggressive destroyer attacks had convinced him he faced main fleet units, not a light escort force. When his ships reported sinking carriers, he believed he had accomplished his mission. The intelligence he was receiving suggested American battleships were approaching from the south, threatening to trap his force. Under these circumstances, withdrawal seemed prudent. Preserve the fleet, avoid being trapped, accept the tactical victory of sinking multiple carriers, which is what Kurita believed he had achieved. The arguments against Kurita's withdrawal focus on what he failed to do. He had broken through to a virtually defenseless target, the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. His battleships and cruisers could have reached the transports, supply ships, and support vessels within 2 hours. The destruction he could have inflicted would have been enormous. Sinking or crippling dozens of transport and support vessels would have seriously disrupted American operations. The Leyte landings might have been delayed. The entire Philippine campaign could have been set back. Even if Kurita's ships were eventually sunk by American counterattack, the damage they inflicted might have been worth the sacrifice. But Kurita didn't know the escort carriers he was engaging were escort carriers, not fleet carriers. He didn't know the invasion fleet lay defenseless just beyond the horizon. He didn't know the American forces he feared were approaching didn't actually exist. He made his decision based on incomplete information in the chaos of battle. The post-war judgment of Kurita remains mixed. He preserved his ships but failed to accomplish the strategic objective of destroying the invasion fleet. He survived the war and lived until 1977, never publicly expressing regret about his decision at Samar. The 186 men from Johnston who survived the sinking faced their own battle for survival. They went into the water in the mid-morning of October 25th, many wounded, some without life jackets, all facing the prospect of spending unknown hours or days adrift in the Philippine Sea. The water temperature was approximately 85 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to prevent immediate hypothermia, but not warm enough to be comfortable for extended periods. Men without life jackets clung to debris, to empty shell casing that floated, to anything that provided buoyancy. Wounded men faced particular difficulties. Those with severe injuries couldn't keep themselves afloat without assistance from others. Men with broken bones or shrapnel wounds suffered terribly as salt water burned in their injuries. Several men who had survived the sinking died during the first hours in the water from wounds or exhaustion. The survivors organized themselves as best they could. Senior surviving officers, Johnston's executive officer Lieutenant Robert Hagan, and several other officers, took command. They gathered men into groups, tied flotation devices together, maintained morale for the first day and night. Shark attacks were a constant fear. The Philippine Sea harbored multiple shark species, including some known to attack humans. Several survivors reported seeing sharks circling their groups. At least 2 men were attacked and killed by sharks during the first 24 hours. Others disappeared during the night and were presumed taken by sharks. Dehydration became a critical problem by the second day. Men surrounded by seawater couldn't drink. Some drank seawater despite warnings from officers and corpsmen that it would make them sicker. Several men died from dehydration-related complications. The Japanese destroyer that some survivors claimed had saluted Johnston reportedly circled the survivors, but did not stop to rescue them or attack them. Several Japanese vessels passed the area during October 25th and 26th, but none stopped. Whether this was deliberate refusal to provide assistance or simple failure to notice survivors in the vast ocean remains unknown. American rescue vessels began searching for survivors on October 26. Destroyers and destroyer escorts from Taffy groups returned to the battle area and began systematic search patterns. The first Johnston survivors were recovered on the afternoon of October 26, approximately 30 hours after the ship sank. Rescue operations continued through October 27th. The last survivors were recovered on October 28th, 3 days after Johnston sank. By this time, several men had died from exposure, dehydration, or wounds. The final survivor count was 186 men recovered alive from Johnston's crew of 327. The survivors were transferred to hospital ships for medical treatment, then evacuated to rear area facilities in New Guinea and Australia. Most survivors eventually recovered from physical injuries, though many carried psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Watching their ship sink, spending days in the water, losing shipmates to wounds and sharks and exhaustion, these experiences haunted many survivors for decades. Admiral Clifton Sprague's after-action report filed in the days following the battle attempted to explain what had happened off Samar. His assessment was blunt. The failure of the enemy to completely wipe out all vessels of this task unit can be attributed to our successful smokescreen, our torpedo counterattack, continuous harassment of enemy by bomb, torpedo, and strafing air attacks, timely maneuvers, and the definite partiality of Almighty God. That final phrase, the definite partiality of Almighty God, reflected Sprague's assessment that divine intervention was the only rational explanation for how Taffy 3 survived. No tactical analysis suggested they should have survived engagement with Kurita's center force. The material odds were too overwhelming. But Sprague's report also credited the aggressive action by his destroyers and destroyer escorts. Their torpedo attacks and gunfire had disrupted the Japanese formation. Their sacrifice had bought time for the carriers. Their courage had made the difference between annihilation and survival. Sprague specifically praised Johnston, Hull, Samuel B. Roberts, and Heerman for their actions. He recommended multiple Medal of Honor awards, though ultimately only Evans received that decoration. The other commanders received Navy Crosses. Sprague himself received the Navy Cross for his tactical command during the battle, his decision to order the escorts to attack rather than retreat, his management of the escort carriers under fire, his coordination of airstrikes, all contributed to Taffy 3's survival. But Sprague never claimed credit for victory. In all his post-war statements about the battle off Samar, he consistently attributed success to the men who fought the battle, the destroyer and destroyer escort crews who charge impossible odds, the aviators who press attacks without adequate weapons, the carrier crews who kept their ships operational under fire. Sprague lived until 1955, dying at age 64. He never wavered in his assessment that the survival of Taffy 3 was due to courage and luck in approximately equal measure, and that the courage came primarily from the men in the small ships who fought against battleships. For 75 years, USS Johnston's wreck lay undiscovered in the Philippine Sea approximately 50 miles east of Samar Island. The depth, estimated at between 21,000 and 20,000 feet, made locating and surveying the wreck extremely difficult with available technology. In October 2019, 75 years after the battle, undersea explorer Victor Vescovo led an expedition to locate and survey Taffy 3 wrecks. Vescovo's team used advanced submersible DSV limiting factor capable of reaching extreme depths. On October 31st, 2019, Vescovo's team located USS Johnston's wreck. The discovery revealed that Johnston had sunk in approximately 21,700 feet of water, making her the deepest shipwreck ever surveyed at that time. The extreme depth had preserved much of the wreck. Vescovo's submersible captured video and still images showing Johnston's hull largely intact though heavily damaged. The video showed Johnston's bow section, separated from the rest of the hull, consistent with survivor accounts that she went down bow first. The bridge area showed massive damage and shell hits that destroyed Johnston's command center. Gun mounts were visible, some still trained toward where the Japanese fleet had been. Torpedo tubes were empty, confirming all torpedoes had been fired. Most poignantly, the video showed personal effects scattered on and around the wreck. Shoes, helmets, pieces of equipment. These items created tangible connection to the men who had fought and died aboard Johnston 75 years earlier. The discovery generated renewed interest in Johnston's story. News coverage brought the battle off Samar back into public consciousness. Surviving family members of Johnston crew expressed gratitude that the ship had been found and documented. The wreck is protected under U.S. law as war grave. Disturbance or salvage is prohibited. The site remains memorial to Commander Evans and the 141 men who went down with Johnston. In March 2021, Vescovo's team returned to survey additional Taffy 3 wrecks. They located and documented USS Samuel B. Roberts at approximately 22,900 feet depth, even deeper than Johnston. The survey revealed similar preservation and similar evidence of the catastrophic damage both ships sustained. These discoveries ensured that Johnston and Samuel B. Roberts would not be forgotten, that their sacrifice would continue to be remembered and honored. The battle off Samar influenced naval warfare doctrine in multiple ways, though some lessons took decades to be fully appreciated. The most immediate lesson was that small warships aggressively employed could disrupt and defeat larger forces under the right circumstances. This wasn't entirely new. Torpedo boats had demonstrated similar principles in earlier wars. But the scale of the disparity at Samar was unprecedented. Destroyers and destroyer escorts engaging battleships shouldn't have achieved anything except their own destruction. But through aggressive tactics, surprise, smoke, and willingness to close to point-blank range, Johnston and her companions disabled cruisers, disrupted the Japanese formation, and ultimately contributed to forcing Kurita's withdrawal. The psychological impact of the torpedo attacks proved more significant than the physical damage inflicted. This reinforced doctrine that emphasized aggressive action, even when materially outmatched. Commanders throughout U.S. Navy studied Samar as an example of how determination and tactical creativity could overcome material disadvantage. The second lesson concerned the vulnerability of capital ships to massed air attack. While the destroyer surface action received most attention, the aircraft from Taffy 3's carriers played equally critical role. Continuous air attacks disrupted Japanese formation, caused casualties, forced ships to maneuver defensively, and ultimately sank 3 heavy cruisers. The carrier aircraft weren't even optimized for fleet engagement. Many were armed with depth charges or small bombs inadequate against armored ships. But through persistence and courage, pilots making dry runs when they had no ammunition, attempting to draw anti-aircraft fire away from armed aircraft, they contributed substantially to the outcome. This validated the concept that carriers had made battleships obsolete as primary strike weapons. Battleships could still provide firepower, but they were increasingly vulnerable to massed air attack. Samar was among the last battles where battleships engaged surface targets. Future naval warfare would be dominated by carriers and missiles. The third lesson, less appreciated at the time, concerned the importance of intelligence and communications. Kurita's confusion about what forces he was engaging, Halsey's decision to leave San Bernardino Strait unguarded, the various misunderstandings and communication failures that led to the battle, all demonstrated how critical information dominance had become in modern warfare. Post-war analysis revealed multiple intelligence failures and communication breakdowns that contributed to the situation at Samar. Better intelligence might have prevented Kurita from achieving surprise. Better communications might have allowed Halsey to realize San Bernardino Strait was unguarded. Better coordination might have prevented the near disaster. Modern naval warfare doctrine places enormous emphasis on information warfare, knowing where enemy forces are, understanding their capabilities and intentions, maintaining communications across vast distances. Samar demonstrated what could happen when those systems failed. The 186 men who survived Johnston's sinking carried their experiences for the rest of their lives. Most returned to civilian life after the war, but the battle off Samar remained a defining experience. Lieutenant Robert Hagen, Johnston's executive officer who survived and led rescue efforts for Johnston survivors in the water, remained in Navy through early 1950s. He later wrote detailed account of the battle and Johnston's actions. His memoir provided much of the detailed information about events aboard Johnston during the battle. Hagen lived until 1990, age 73. Lieutenant Ed DeGardy, Johnston's gunnery officer who controlled the ship's gunfire until he was killed when the gun director was hit, was posthumously awarded Silver Star. His family received his medal and his Purple Heart at ceremony in 1945. His story exemplified the junior officers who fought alongside Evans. Chief Boatswain's Mate Charles Cothran, senior enlisted man who survived, later testified at multiple Navy boards and inquiries about the battle. His detailed account helped establish timeline of events and damage sustained by Johnston. Cothran remained in Navy until retirement in early 1950s, then worked as civilian naval contractor. He died in 1981. Many survivors suffered what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares about the battle, anxiety around loud noises or fire, survivor guilt about shipmates who didn't make it, depression. In 1940s and 1950s, these conditions weren't well understood or effectively treated. Many survivors simply carried their trauma silently. Reunions of Johnston survivors began in 1950s and continued for decades. Annual gatherings allowed survivors to share memories, honor fallen shipmates, and maintain connections forged during the battle. As survivors' age and numbers dwindled, reunions became increasingly important to those who remained. The last known survivor of USS Johnston, Dudley Moylan, died in 2022 at age 99. With his death, Johnston's story passed completely from living memory into history. No one remains alive who experienced the battle aboard Johnston firsthand, but the survivors ensured their story would be remembered through memoirs, through interviews with historians, through testimony at ceremonies and educational events. Johnston survivors preserved detailed account of what happened off Samar. Their voices ensured Commander Evans's courage and their own sacrifice would not be forgotten. Japanese battleships never expected 5 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts to charge because such action violated every principle of rational naval warfare. Small ships don't attack battleships. Destroyers don't engage vessels 50 times their displacement. Warships don't continue fighting after sustaining catastrophic damage. Commanders don't take their ships into battles they cannot possibly win. USS Johnston proved all these assumptions wrong. Commander Evans saw the Japanese fleet bearing down on defenseless escort carriers and made instant decision to attack. No hesitation, no calculation of odds, no waiting for orders. He turned Johnston toward the enemy and attacked at flank speed. For 3 hours, Johnston fought impossible battle. She disabled a heavy cruiser with torpedo attack at point-blank range. She dueled with battleships whose guns could fire shells weighing more than her entire torpedo armament. She took hits that should have sunk her instantly and kept fighting. She drew Japanese fire away from the carriers, buying them time to escape. When Johnston finally sank, she had accomplished what seemed impossible, helping to turn back the most powerful Japanese surface force committed to battle in over 2 years, saving the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf, contributing to what Admiral Sprague called divine intervention, but what was actually courage, tactical skill, and absolute refusal to surrender. Commander Evans demonstrated leadership that went beyond any reasonable expectation. He charged battleships in a destroyer. He kept fighting while severely wounded. He stayed with his ship when he could have saved himself. He died at his post commanding USS Johnston to the end. The 141 men who died with Johnston chose to fight alongside their commander. Gun crews stayed at their stations while battleship shells exploded around them. Engineers remained in flooded machinery spaces. Damage control teams worked to save their ship. They fought because Evans fought, because Johnston was a fighting ship, because surrender wasn't considered even when survival seemed impossible. From Halsey Pass to Pearl Harbor, from Samar to every naval battle where small forces faced overwhelming odds, the lesson remains consistent. Courage, determination, aggressive action, and refusal to accept defeat can achieve results that no tactical analysis suggests are possible. 2,300 tons displacement, 5 5-inch guns, 10 torpedoes, 327 crew. USS Johnston charged 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. She shouldn't have survived the first 5 minutes. She fought for 3 hours and helped save an entire invasion fleet. The gun Ernest Evans chose to go into harm's way became the gun that changed naval history. Not through technology, not through superior numbers, but through courage that went beyond any reasonable expectation, through leadership that inspired men to follow impossible orders, through determination that refused to acknowledge defeat even when defeat was inevitable. Act 8-8, Night Witches, Nak Ni Vedmi, and USS Johnston. Different weapons, different wars, different theaters, but the same lesson repeated throughout military history. Sometimes the most effective weapon is the one wielded by people who refuse to quit, who charge when logic says retreat, who fight when survival demands surrender. Commander Ernest E. Evans, 46 years old, part Cherokee, Medal of Honor recipient. USS Johnston, Fletcher-Class destroyer DD 557. October 25, 1944. Battle off Samar, the destroyer that charged battleships and lived in history forever.